Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all to my podcast, Don't Get a Therapist Yet. And today I have a very interesting guest who is an amazingly author, therapist, and has got so much knowledge to share about relationships, especially when they go wrong. Her name is Krystal Mazzola Wood. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. So, a very warm welcome to you, Krystal. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show.
Thank you so much for having me, Wendy. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Me too. I'm very excited as well. And let's just start by perhaps you can tell some of the listeners a little bit more about yourself because you are an author, and again, you've got a very interesting speciality.
Yes, of course. So, as you said, my background is in marriage and family therapy. I have been practicing now for over 15 years, and some of my most formative training came with Pia Melody, who wrote Facing Codependence. And through my experience working at the Meadows, I've developed a deep understanding around codependency, which is really the pattern of losing ourselves in our relationships. And that has become an area of treatment that I so love. And as I was treating codependency, I realized that there's such a common component to codependency and also just clients seeking therapy, where many of them are in relationships that we would call toxic. And toxic simply means poisonous, it's harmful to our well being. Many people struggle in relationships that hurt them rather than nurturing and supporting them and bringing us up, which is what a healthy relationship does.
Mm. And I think your point is so significant because I think a lot of people actually struggle with the difference between what they see as a healthy conflict and perhaps being trapped in a toxic dynamic, which is obviously very unhealthy. What would you say is the actual difference then? Could you explain that a bit more, Krystal?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that there's so many common narratives that reinforce toxic patterns. I just want to name that. And again,
Mm.
there's a difference between healthy conflict. Healthy conflict is going to happen in any relationship because we're two separate people. We have different backgrounds, we have different values, different preferences. Of course, we're going to disagree sometimes. But even when we disagree, there's still a lot of support. For example, research shows that even when couples who have a healthy relationship argue, they're having five positive interactions to every one negative. And what that means is that even when they're fighting, they're saying things like, you know what, I see your perspective, or, I've been a little too harsh there. I'm so sorry. And so 5 times compared to one, they're doing those positive things when there's healthy conflict. But in couples that are struggling, that's less than 1 to 1. So they're having more negatives to positive interactions. So these are the couples that I have worked with where they say, oh, you know what, our fights go from 0 to 100 because there's none of that like natural cooling that happens when you're validating your partner, when you're trying to negotiate, see eye to eye. These couples are really taking a disagreement, they're throwing in everything that's ever happened in the last 10 years that they've been keeping score about. They might be yelling. There's Sometimes there's really attacks also on who the person is. One of the most problematic behaviors in relationships where healthy couples really have none of this is called contempt. And contempt is literally poisonous to our health. People who experience contempt from their partners actually struggle with more illnesses over the year. If you're experiencing contempt, it's literally poisonous to our well-being. And so contempt is where your partner not only criticizes you, but they act as if they're better than you. Like, for example, if you have 2 children with your partner, if your partner says something like, well, actually, I have 3 children, including you, that would be an example of contempt. And that's incredibly common in these toxic relationships. And therefore, I really think that the idea of it being poisonous is so relevant because it doesn't just harm our emotional and mental health, it impacts our focus, it impacts our relationships with other people, it impacts our self-esteem and our finances, and ultimately it can impact our physical health and longevity.
Wow, there is so much rich information just in that answer, Krystal. I mean, and just to actually be able to name the 5 to 1 is amazing. And that's a really good way that people can actually perhaps start to measure their relationships as, how many arguments are they having? And 5 to 1 is quite a good dynamic rather than each one being in a toxic dynamic. And I know there's a lot of behaviors which people label as either red flags, or often people use the word narcissist and they sort of throw it around a lot. I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about why these people use these terms, and what's behind these actual terms?
Well, there's a lot there. I think
Yeah, there is.
important that we educate one another around what are unhealthy behaviors, what are red
Mhm.
flags. I personally have struggled with codependency and toxic relationships. This is, I bring my professional experience and my personal experience to my
Mhm.
books around recovery for codependency and toxic relationships. And I remember many years ago reading, when red flags wave, pay attention or pay with pain. I've never been able to figure out who said it, but when I was in these toxic patterns, I didn't even know it was a problem, for example, if someone would make plans with me and then not even follow up to cancel. They just didn't ever follow up with me. I thought that maybe I was just being too sensitive. So I think that there's a lot of value in naming problematic behaviors like inconsistency in a relationship. But I think like anything that gets a lot of traction in popular culture, I think things can be boiled down to very all or nothing thinking, where it can become a little extreme. Whereas really with healthy relationships, with healthy sense of self, even you understand that most things are kind of gray. There's a lot of both and in reality. So while some things are absolutely red flags, like contempt, being name called by a partner, there are other things that are sometimes called red flags that are more preferences. Like it's not necessarily a red flag if someone wants to see you a few times in one week, but that might be a red flag to someone who has avoidant attachment, for example. And so sometimes people are calling red flags when they're really just preferences. So I think it's really important that when we digest this information that we're really discerning. I have clients coming to me in my work, both as a therapist and as a codependency recovery coach, where they're telling me things that they hear on social media, like, oh, I know it's a problem if I, don't cuddle my partner all night long. And I'm like, wait, where did you hear that? And they're often talking about Instagram. And I think when we're talking about now narcissism, which of course is thrown around a lot, I think it's a both and. Yes, we need to educate people that people with truly narcissistic behaviors genuinely are more exploitative. They genuinely, for example, I just saw a study that came out that showed people with these personality traits of more like the dark personality, the narcissistic personality traits, they genuinely are more exploitative in sexual relationships, for example. That's something we need to talk about. Like, if your partner's not respecting your no around like sexual consent, big problem. That is a sign of narcissistic abuse. But also, sometimes people behave in ways that are offensive, not relational, but it doesn't mean they qualify for an official personality disorder diagnosis. Because very few people actually, I think, it's definitely, I think it's under 5% of the population actually qualifies for a full narcissistic personality disorder diagnosis. And so some behaviors are more avoidant behaviors than true narcissism.
Mm. And I think there's a big difference, isn't there, Krystal, between somebody yourself who is an expert in this area, who's done your qualifications, you've done your research, you've written your books as well, for you to really deeply understand these terms, whereas sometimes they are sort of thrown around in social media and people just kind of use them as very loose labels, which isn't always helpful sometimes.
Absolutely. I think
Mm,
too, if someone wants to repair their relationship, doubling down on the idea that your partner has a label can sometimes prevent the intimacy you're looking for.
mm,
I think if you think about the behaviors you don't like, you know what, I really don't like when you spend all your time at work, or when you talk to other women flirtatiously. When we look at those behaviors and we give our partner feedback around that, that's so much more useful than, you know, painting them with a, broad, stroke and saying, oh, you're a narcissist, and then
mm,
acting as if they're hopeless or as if you're better than them. Because again, anytime we communicate with our partner as if we're better than them, that is contemptuous.
mm. That's really interesting. And I think sometimes, is there a link between what people have been brought up in their childhood, say their attachment styles? Um, does that actually make a difference to the type of relationships they might have later?
Absolutely. Over 50 years ago, researchers Bowlby and John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, they discovered that attachment to other human beings is a basic non-negotiable need. But the way we form our attachments differs depending on what we receive when we're growing up. Some people, though, really do get good enough attachment as a child, and then that it's injured as an adult. But basically, when we have reliable, consistent, trustworthy adults caring for us, we develop a secure attachment style. When we have a secure attachment style, we know that we are worthy. We know we deserve respect. And so people with a secure attachment style don't have a lot of inner conflict around setting boundaries, for example, around disrespect. People who have a non-secure attachment style, like an anxious attachment style, for example, might think, oh no, if I tell them that they need to respect my time, they might just abandon me. So I should just take what I can get. And so this absolutely impacts the way we show up in our relationships. Secure attachment much lays the foundation for healthy adult relationships. We know our worth, we're respectful of other people, we're really just discerning around who's trustworthy and or not. Like, we understand that some people are trustworthy and some people aren't. And it's not really personal. If I encounter someone who lies to me, I'm not going to think like, oh, this is every person, or I'm not going to think this is about me. Rather, I'll just say, I don't like that this person lies to me. I'm going to keep my distance from them if we have secure attachment. But if we have non-secure attachment, a person with avoidant attachment, for example, might say, you know what, that just reinforces my belief that other people are unreliable and I have to just rely on myself and no one's trustworthy. So I better not get in a relationship. Or a person with an anxious attachment, again, might say, well, I'm not worth much. So crumbs of this attention, even from someone unreliable, is better than nothing.
Gosh, that really does explain the link. That's amazing, isn't it? How just how you're brought up as a child could really still affect your relationships when you get older. And I just wonder if say a person with an anxious attachment style, how would they respond to a person who perhaps crossed their boundary? And what was the biggest barrier for them to change, do you think, if they got an anxious attachment style?
Yes, I think it's kind of, it intersects. So that's a great question. So someone with an anxious attachment style is going to be very reticent to set boundaries. First, they might not even know what their needs and limits are. A person with anxious attachment is so focused on maintaining connection with other people, which again is a non-negotiable human need. There's no problem in that. But they think that to maintain that connection, they have to sacrifice who they are. And so they might not even be connected with their needs or limits. But oftentimes people with anxious attachment, which I really think of as kind of codependency, like enacted, like someone who has codependency or anxious attachment, they're often going to second guess their boundaries. If they even know what they are, they're going to say, maybe I'm just asking for too much. Maybe I'm too sensitive. It's really not that big of a deal. They said they wouldn't care if I did this, so why am I making a big deal about it? So they'll really talk themselves out of their boundaries, even they even know what they are. But then over time, they start to build resentment. And these people will sometimes be passive aggressive. They'll later explode because they've been holding in their needs for so long. And so it kind of creates this really confusing process where they really seem very easygoing, they're kind of placating, and then all of a sudden they might explode over like the sock on the floor, but it's not even about the sock on the floor. It's about all the things they've been denying. And so their biggest barrier to setting healthy, consistent boundaries is they might not even know what they are. They second guess them when they do. And even when they know their own boundaries, they often will feel tremendous guilt over having any sort of negative, quote unquote, impact on the other person. They think that any sort of discomfort that they might cause, even by asking for basic respect, is hurting someone else. And so they feel tremendous guilt setting boundaries. And that those are some of the biggest barriers for them.
Wow, that's amazing. I can really see how that can play out in a relationship. How somebody with such little self-esteem doesn't even, like you said, doesn't even know what a boundary is, let alone how to respond to a cross boundary. That's really interesting. And Chris, you also mentioned an avoidant attachment style. And I'm wondering how that affects, say, in a relationship, their ability to nurture closeness. And if they're avoidant, do they get stuck in a particular relationship, a toxic relationship? Can you tell us a bit more about avoidant attachment style?
Absolutely. So we can kind of think of as anxious attachment as people who don't have enough boundaries. They don't have enough self-protection. And avoidant attachment lives on the other extreme, where these are people who we can really think of it as like they hide behind walls. And they hide behind walls so they don't have to be as close to other people. They think of as like intimacy, the natural need for closeness. Sometimes they perceive it as weakness, and it also seems very dangerous to them. A lot of times people with avoidant attachment perceive intimacy as suffocation, that they believe if I show up in this relationship, I will lose myself. They will ask too much of me. And so I really have to keep my distance to protect myself. And so we call anxious attachment anxious, but both avoidance and anxiously attached people are afraid of the natural need for closeness. It just manifests very differently. So avoidance are going to put up walls. These are the people that might spend 80 hours a week working, even though they have a close relationship at home. And they might create walls by also maybe cheating on their partner or having a video game addiction or a gambling addiction. In some way, they make themselves incredibly inaccessible to their partner. And that's really the difference. And these people are going to perceive their partner's natural need for closeness, which again, basic human need. They're going to perceive it as them asking for too much, as them being needy. So they're a lot more willing to push back on their partner. So even if, like, let's say their anxiously attached partner gets the courage to say, I'd like to spend more time with you. This other person might say, the avoidantly attached person might say, I'm working for our family. I'm paying the bills. Why are you so needy? Can't you see everything I already do? And so both become incredibly resentful, and then it reinforces their attachment style, but it just manifests in really opposite ways.
Gosh, that's amazing. And I'm sure lots of listeners can relate to that as well, and how people put their needs before their relationship. Like you say, they become workaholics, or they just gamble, or they play video games, and the impact that actually has on their partner um, is again more resentment, isn't it? Yeah, that's really interesting. And my next question is, what do you think about the popular narrative that we shouldn't need anyone to have a healthy relationship? What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a great question. So again, I think attachment theory is so important when we're looking at relationships and healthy
Mm.
relationships and mental well-being, because fundamentally the science shows we need human connection. Loneliness, it's a popular citation now, but loneliness has been found to be as detrimental to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. People who
Wow.
are lonely are more likely to have heart issues as well, be more at risk for things such as heart attacks.
Oh,
Loneliness
gosh.
literally is harmful. And so even if there's this story in our culture that we don't need people, our physiology does, our body does, our nervous system does. And so our mind is sometimes in conflict with our nervous system, with our biology. But our biology knows we need to live in community with other people. In fact, our nervous system co-regulates. So what that means is if I'm around someone who's incredibly agitated, I'm probably going to get agitated. But if I'm around someone who's calm, I'm going to calm down. It's kind of like the image of like the healthy parent rubbing their child's back when they're really overwhelmed. If the parent can stay calm, that child's naturally going to absorb that sense of calm.
Mm.
And this isn't just theoretical or mental, it's on a nervous system level. And nervous system dictates if we're safe or unsafe. It's very primal. Am I safe or unsafe? And our relationships with other people dictate how safe we feel moving through our lives. And if we don't feel safe, we're going to have what looks like anxiety, depression, focus issues, motivation issues, maybe even appetite issues. But really, sometimes it's really a lack of healthy connections with other people. And that's why I'm so passionate about this work, because I truly believe that sometimes what we're calling mental health issues or diagnosing is really about a lack of healthy, close, safe, consistent relationships. Because we need it physiologically, even if people say we shouldn't need it. That's just false.
Mm. Yeah, that is so good and that's so powerful. And you can really see, I've also this image of this parent sort of, you know, gently soothing their child by just massaging their back. And that touch and that message is saying, you'll be okay. I'm soothing you physiologically, aren't they, by doing that as well? And that calm parent is giving that calmness to that child. And what happens if they don't get that? They don't learn to self-regulate. And then I think what you're saying, therefore, is they don't have a strong, secure attachment style, and therefore they don't attract somebody who is good for them. They're more likely to attract somebody who has an unhealthy attachment style. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, you're exactly right.
Mm,
It's those dots are connected.
mm. Yeah, gosh, yeah. Amazing, 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 Krystal. So, um, and I'm just wondering also if somebody doesn't have that secure attachment style and they're not in touch with their own emotional needs, their own pain, how actually they come across and how they don't even recognize their needs or their pain. Um, do they have a habit, do you think, of gaslighting themselves? They can't really trust themselves because they don't have that sort of self-understanding or that awareness, so they gaslight themselves.
Yes, I see that all the time, especially more with anxious or disorganized attachment. Some people have a combination of anxious avoidant attachment where because they didn't have enough safe, reliable relationships that acted as a container, they now really second guess their own needs and they gaslight themselves really consistently. It's probably one of the biggest barriers to healthy change that I see in my clients is they're just very attached to the idea that their needs, their perspective is wrong. And they really, I'm working primarily with anxiously attached or disorganized attachment, where they really minimize their own needs to the point where much of their mental loops are preoccupied with thinking why they're wrong, why their needs are wrong, why their perspective is wrong, and how they need to just be a better partner, and then everything will be okay in their relationship.
Mm. And that's very hard to help them, I suppose, because if their gaslighting is so deep and their lack of trust of themselves is so strong, it must be really hard. Like you say, that's the biggest problem you see in therapy, to actually help them to move away from that.
Yes, it is a huge problem. And one thing I really learned, though, that helps is helping these clients stop prioritizing these mental loops and start dropping down into their bodies. So a lot of times people who gaslight themselves really live in their mind. They're not very attached to their body. Like they're not realizing, for example, for the listeners right now, like what their stomach feels like in this moment, or their chest or their shoulders. A lot of times they're not aware of what's going on physically for them. And oftentimes when they start to put just literal mindful awareness of like, oh, my shoulder's tight, I'm clenching my jaw, my chest feels pressured, that awareness of their body starts to help them build a connection back to themselves. And when they start to build that connection back to themselves, bit by bit, they begin to trust themselves again, because we can't really trust someone we have no connection with. And it's not just the mind, it's the body that we have to drop down. And I think that that's been the biggest shift over the last 5 years of my practice. Is I have, even in my, prior than 5 years ago, in my first book, The Codependency Recovery Plan, I mentioned some things about somatic practices, and my codependency workbook, I talk about yoga, and that is important. But even more so in the last 5 years, I realized we cannot talk someone out of gaslighting themselves. They just simply have to feel their body again and feel connection with them again and with themselves again. And I think that this refers to, we keep talking about attachment, but really the reason people become non-securely attached is because they have what we call trauma. Trauma simply means a wound. If you don't have enough safe, reliable adults growing up, or trustworthy adults, like if you didn't know, for example, if mom was going to be in a good mood or a bad mood when you came home, and you always felt like you were walking on eggshells. Maybe nothing overtly bad happened, but just that sense can be wounding for us. And this trauma often makes us disconnect from our bodies to survive, because we really become focused on the external to survive, but we have to drop down in our bodies to stop gaslighting ourselves and to become securely attached, which is the foundation of all our healthy relationships.
Yeah, that is so profound and so deep, and I really hope people just hear that one message. Is amazing, isn't it, Krystal? I think to actually just know that they did that simple process of that self-awareness, connecting with themselves, their own bodies, to be, cut off from their own bodies and to really get into the sense of getting to know themselves again. That's really powerful, I think. Yeah, really good. And I love the idea of, I don't love the idea, but I love the concept of this idea of you're gaslighting yourself. I haven't heard that before. You normally think gaslighting other people, but people gaslight themselves. I think that's a really good way of describing how people react. That's amazing. Um, and I'm just wondering if, again, people might start to have a relationship and they might start to trust somebody again and they might start to get close, but then they're having problems. Perhaps they're feeling, again, their partner's criticizing them, or maybe they're too attached and they're feeling suffocated. I mean, how can they deal with that? How can they kind of like try to deal with those perhaps challenges in their relationships now that they've started to move towards a relationship?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think the first simplest answer is mindfulness. We want to be mindful of when our urges are aligned with non-secure attachment and then behave in a securely attached way. For example, maybe you have the urge to ghost someone because it's feeling like you're getting too close to someone. Just being aware of that urge that you want to just cut off that communication is really important, because then you can make a conscious choice. Do I actually want to ghost this person? Or do I want to be courageous and keep showing up for this relationship? Or maybe courageous and tell them, you know what, I think seeing each other 2 times a week just feels like a little bit too much, but I really want this relationship. Can we cut it back to once a week so it just feels a little bit more comfortable right now as I learn how to have a really healthy relationship? And so I think it's just that mindfulness and then choice if we're going to act in our non-secure ways or choose to be secure. And the anxiously attached person, for example, could go, oh, you know what? I'm aware that I'm gaslighting myself, but my need for my partner to spend some time with me on the weekends is not going away. I need to communicate this. I need to be courageous. And I keep using the word courageous because we're not going to talk ourselves out of our fear when it comes to putting down our walls or having healthy boundaries or having open communication. Rather, we just choose if we're going to respond to it with maturity and courage and do the healthy thing, or if we're going to fall back into our same non-securely attached patterns. And I say that without judgment, but it is a choice. And I think I mentioned this in the last chapter of my toxic relationship recovery workbook, but I'm someone who had disorganized attachment. It's, or anxious avoidant attachment. I had a combination of both. And when I met my husband on our second date, he was so warm and attentive and kind that I felt like running away. Every part of me felt like screaming and running for the hills because it felt so threatening to have someone that I was interested in be available to me. But I remember in that moment breathing and making a conscious choice to lean in. I literally leaned into a hug that he was offering for me. And, that was our second date, and we've been happily married for years. So we get to choose. Just because we've behaved in a certain way in the past does not dictate our future.
Mm. And that's such a powerful message, isn't it? Even though perhaps in your childhood you didn't have a secure attachment, that you can actually grow that in a relationship and that you can actually make that choice. And I love the word courageous that you said there. You have to sometimes really feel the fear and put yourself out there and say this might feel very scary to actually say how I really feel, and that takes a lot of courage. But then hopefully the reward is that you do get that wonderful relationship because you've stepped into that kind of behavior, rather than your old patterns which actually take you away from healthy relationships. It's a very good message to hear that they can learn these skills and they can change and they can have healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
Well, in fact, your book is all about recovery as well, isn't it? It's the recovery from toxic relationships so that there's also hope that you can recover from having a toxic relationship and to use all those experiences to then move on to a healthy relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just wondering, when someone actually is in a toxic relationship, that they notice that the dynamic is toxic, um, and their focus is entirely on getting their partner to change. And I was wondering what you think about this. Do you think it's a losing battle? And if you think it's a losing battle, is there anything else they can do instead?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much. It is something I see all the time, especially in the clients that I work with, is they're really focused on how they can get their partner to change, how their partner could just be better for them. There's kind of like this duality where they think that if they could be perfect, then the relationship will be great. But also the things that they're uncomfortable around, they really wonder how they can force change upon their partner. And that, of like you use this term, it is always a losing battle. We cannot control or change other people. The only thing we can do is we can change our behaviors and potentially positively influence others. Sometimes when we focus on our own change, our partner starts to make their own changes, because really the way relationships work is if we become healthier, if I, for example, start to truly believe I deserve respect, my partner is either going to need to become more respectful or they will fall away from my life. And so some people are going to take that as an opportunity of like, wait, I really don't want to lose my partner. Now I'm going to change. But it's kind of the irony. The only time our partners potentially change is with our own change process. So the most powerful thing we can do is to focus on changing our own patterns of behavior that are non-securely attached, whether that's not setting boundaries, or if it's not communicating openly, harboring resentments, and then kind of trying to punish people behind their back, but not telling them exactly what we need. All of these different behaviors that show up in toxic patterns, we can only focus on interrupting our own. And it is absolutely true that in toxic relationships, there's absolutely abuse. And we are never responsible if someone chooses to abuse us. For example, if someone physically abuses you, you are never responsible for that. And at the same time, you must start to focus on making the changes that are going to help empower you to protect yourself from abuse. You are empowered to protect yourself from abuse. That's part of this change process. For example, if there is physical abuse in a relationship, then potentially you might need to start focusing on how you can earn some income. Because a lot of times in these relationships, there's also financial abuse. And so if you can start building an income and have your own bank account, for example, you're more empowered to leave or find your own apartment, so that you can leave this relationship. We have to focus on the ways we're going to protect ourselves to change unhealthy or toxic dynamics. And there's a whole range of toxic dynamics. Sometimes it's just that, the like 0 to 100 fights, but sometimes it is physically abusive or sexually abusive, but we're still empowered. And it's complex, because I always want to make sure people hear that I am not blaming anyone for abuse, but we are always empowered as adults to take changes that empower and protect us. And I think that that is so amazing. And that's what my toxic relationship recovery workbook's fundamentally about, is we stop looking at your partner. If you're still in that relationship, we stop looking at that partner, and we stop looking behind, and we stop wondering how they could have changed. And instead, I actually guide you through different exercises to build your secure attachment. So whether you're anxiously or avoidantly attached, those exercises guide you towards secure attachment. That's the only way you're going to change your life.
Wow, that's amazing. That's such a good, amazing way of helping people to recover from toxic relationships. And I think it's an amazing book, and I hope loads of people try it, because it just sounds like it's such a good thing to do. And you're so right, Krystal, as another therapist, all the time you get comments about wanting their partners to change, and you have to keep on reinforcing, as the change starts with you. And this book can really help people to actually build that change, and actually to be to have that connection with themselves, and to fall in love with themselves initially, primarily, in order that they can be healthy enough to attract a partner who is a good match for them, and so healthy. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story as well. That makes it so much more powerful. How you met somebody who was so warm and lovely, you almost couldn't handle it. You had to actually work on accepting that warmth, that hug from him. I think it's always more powerful when a therapist himself has had some personal experience, and that comes through in your work as well. You're so compassionate and so passionate about your work, and you really know it because you felt it yourself. You know what it's like to have those experiences, and it comes through. So thank you for that. So you're very welcome. So if someone is experiencing, feelings of abandonment or in a toxic cycle right now, what do you recommend would their next steps be?
Yes. So first, I just want to say there's absolutely hope. I know how hopeless and powerless this can feel sometimes, but there's absolutely hope. And kind of the next steps really depend on, um, you know, what feels right for you. But I would first recommend that if you aren't aware yet and you really want validation around the dynamics in your relationship, I have an assessment on my website that assesses the safety of your relationship. It's actually one of the assessments in my toxic relationship recovery workbook. And as I said, there's a lot of minimizing and gaslighting that I see in the clients who are in toxic relationships that I've worked with. And I think that if you get your actual score, it's proof of sometimes that I'm not asking for too much. Actually, my relationship isn't safe for me. And so sometimes having that proof or that tangible score can really reinforce, I need to focus on my relationship. I need to focus on my relationship with myself, so that I can be safe. So there's that assessment. I also, they have, if someone wants to kind of do this path on their own, my toxic relationship recovery workbook guides them step by step. I put, like, honestly, I took so much time and I put everything I wish that I could have heard when I was struggling with these patterns and so confused and lonely into this workbook, and of course it's based on all my years of practice, that it's like evidence-based. So there's my workbook. I also have other books that depending on what people need, if they feel like they resonate with this idea of anxious attachment, then my book around setting boundaries has 100 different exercises that they can practice to implement boundaries tangibly. I have my codependency recovery books. And then also, if someone is just really ready to have support, an actual guide in this process, I have a few spots open for my codependency recovery coaching, which, as I said, is really anxious attachment enacted. And this is where they get to go through the steps of my recovery processes featured in my toxic relationship recovery workbook and my codependency recovery plan. There's different steps there, and I guide them through it step by step so that they truly can become securely attached. I know for a fact it's possible. I've witnessed many clients do it, and it's work that I'm really passionate about.
It sounds amazing, and it sounds as though so many choices are there to people depending on what stage they're in as well. And I love your emphasis on hope, so that people actually do know, because people can feel so hopeless and helpless, can't they? They do know that they can actually make that such a difference in their life. Their life can be so much more richer. Because you're right, we are built for connection, aren't we? And we need that connection. And if people can't get that connection, that can feel so hopeless and helpless. But I love the way you actually want to instill hope in people and give them the skills so that they can actually find the right relationship with them. So, Krystal, it's been a joy having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your rich pearls of wisdom, and for sharing actually putting so much effort into all these books that you have written, which sound really amazing. And those details will be available in the show notes if people actually want to download or go to your website or audiobook. That will be available in the show notes. So, Krystal, thank you so much for your amazing, amazing work. You've worked so hard to share such wonderful information to people. So thank you, Krystal, so much.
Thank you, Wendy. It's been such a pleasure.
Okay. And thank you for listening, everyone.